Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Shane Souls. This is the history of pro wrestling. Before we kick into gear here, I did briefly want to go over some wrestling vocab. Pay close attention. There will be a test at the end, so make sure to take your notes. Just a few lingo, a few words, insider lingo that might make sense to you down the road. If you don't know, great way to learn. First off, we have babyface, or face for short. That is, of course, good guy. You like the baby faces. We want them to win. Opposite of that, of course, we have the heel, which is bad guy. You boo the bad guys. You boo the heels. Boo. We have work. That doesn't mean the work you do. It's fake, predetermined. Something is a work, or you're working when you're doing a match. Again, opposite of that, we have shoot, which is real, not planned. Not a work. That was a shoot. I mean, that was not a planned thing that happened. Next, we have book or booker, and that is basically something that is planned. Planning a storyline, planning an angle, or the booker being the person who puts the matches together. Potato, not just a delicious vegetable. That's when you punch somebody in the head real hard. When you weren't supposed to, generally. Or maybe they had it coming. Hey, I don't know. I'm not here to judge. But when you get a potato, well, then you got a receipt coming. Term for returning, particularly, is to shots back to the wrestler. So if you get potatoed, then you give them a receipt back. And then lastly, botch. Something, usually a scripted move or spoken line, which does not go as planned due to a mistake. Hopefully, I do not botch this presentation. Now, in the beginning, you've probably heard folks say something like, as American as, fill in the blank, apple pie, baseball. But something that never gets tacked on is pro wrestling, which is weird if you think about it. Wrestling, pro wrestling specifically, has been around for over 100 years and became very popularized here in the US shortly after the Civil War. But before there was professional wrestling outright, there were showman competitions in the 1830s where performers would invite crowd members to try to wrestle them and knock them down for 500 francs, which would be about $5,000 in today's money. So just competitions going around like little fairs and whatnot, big tough dudes come try to knock me down. And that's kind of where the root of what wrestling became started. Some fun names from that time period that we have record of: Edward the Steel Eater, Gustav the Bone Wrecker, and then my personal favorite, Bonnet the Axe of the Low Alps. Of course, after that, we get to the carnival days. As carnivals progressed, pro wrestling emerged in the late 1860s and 70s as traveling performers staged matches for mass entertainment. Wrestlers, often former amateur athletes, participated in carnivals, the promoters known as carnies. Yes, that word has been around a very long time. Wrestling exhibitions evolved with colorful costumes and fictional biographies, emphasizing entertainment over competitiveness. We start to see the transition, basically, from just knock me down to actually trying to put on something that looks like a competitive match. Going further, we have evolution and changes in this format. 3 key groups influenced the sport's nature: impresarios, carnies, and barnstormers. Impresarios managed wrestlers, creating their personas for fame and interest, really helped them put together a sort of character to sell to the crowd. Carnies, who were the main wrestlers, devised dangerous moves or hooks and engaged in high-stakes challenges. So essentially, they would be the ones that would hurt you if you tried to get a little too real with them. And then lastly, we have the barnstormers, who cooperated with the carnies, leading to the transition of wrestling into a business-oriented entertainment venture. So a lot of this was betting. Who's going to win the match? Because it was roughly seen as a serious competitive fight, and wherever there's betting, there's cheating. And that's what the barnstormers were really good at, being able to take a fall, or in some cases, get the upset win to make sure everybody on the inside got as much money as possible. Beyond the 1800s, we get to the early 1900s, or the Farmer Burns and Frank Gotch era. Late 19th century saw dominance by Martin Farmer Burns and his pupil Frank Gotch. Burns, a competitive wrestler, trained Gotch, who became a sports superstar. Gotch claimed the world's undisputed heavyweight champion. Burns fought over 6,000 wrestlers during his time, and at a time when most of those were fairly competitive matches, and lost fewer than 10 of them. He was a very, very tough dude who taught Frank Gotch, who became one of the biggest sports stars of his time, even as far as any other sport, like baseball was still very popular at this time. Frank Gotch was just as nationally known as any baseball star would have been at that time. And it was really, wrestling was really only second to baseball as far as popularity grew, as far as popularity goes around that time as well. We mentioned here that he became the world's undisputed championship. He did that by beating European wrestling champion George Hackenschmidt in 1908 and 1911, claiming to be the world champion because he beat both national champions here and international champions in Europe. Wrestling faced challenges, however, in the early 20th century, including doubts of its legitimacy and a decline in popularity after Gotch's retirement in 1913. While it's never been confirmed necessarily, it's widely believed that the word about the lack of legitimacy was spread by the boxing commissions of the time, because a lot of wrestling was taking away a lot of the box office that boxing was getting. So it's rumored to have come from that field, this push against the legitimacy of what wrestling was. So there was a time, actually before I forget, here's Frank Gotch. There's that guy. Huge star. So there's a time when wrestling didn't have any big names to light it up. Frank Gotch retired. There's not a lot of big names. No one's really paying super close attention to it. And the flower of wrestling is wilting. But when a flower wilts, it drops seeds, and those seeds grow. And that's exactly what happened. 3 men. In an effort to attract a wider audience, a group of 3 men changed the game. We have Ed Lewis, we have Billy Sandow, and Toots Mont. Is Toots funny? Is that why you're laughing? These 3 were known as the Gold Dust Trio. These were men that loved wrestling and really wanted to make it a big deal again. Like after its legitimacy had dropped, just try to change the game entirely and make it something much more interesting. Formation of the Gold Dust Trio. As I said, they revolutionized wrestling in the 20s, introduced innovations like time limit matches, flashy holds, signature maneuvers, and popularized tag team wrestling. So as I said here, the time limit matches, we just a little bit ago talked about the big world title match between Frank Gotch and George Hackenschmidt. That match lasted almost 2 hours. Very long, dudes on the ground grabbing a hold, not very flashy. If you're into that, hey, I get it. But if you want something flashy and fun, that's what these guys did. They introduced new moves like crazy maneuvers like a suplex or a body slam. Let's pick a guy up and throw him down. That looks cool. Grabbing a headlock, not as cool. So that's what these guys were doing. They're making it more flashy, more entertaining. By having time limits, you could get a short match that's not going to take all damn night. And then they popularized tag team wrestling. We don't quite know where exactly tag team wrestling started. There's a few disputed accounts of where it started, but these guys definitely made it mainstream. Tag team, for those who don't know, is 2-on-2 matches, where you tag in and out. Also, packaged shows and long-term contracts. The trio's lasting legacy was their use of a regular group of wrestlers for a packaged show. Instead of hiring wrestlers for specific dates, they kept wrestlers for extended periods, allowing for long-term stories and feuds. This approach was a key factor in their success, providing regular and unique wrestling cards. So kind of before they really set up a promotion, wrestling was just kind of, I want to make a wrestling show, who's available, all right, you're on the show, you're going to fight. These guys actually made the idea of, you are going to sign a contract and you're going to work here for me for this amount of time on these days, which allowed them to create feuds that would take months or even years to fulfill. So that kept people coming back for long periods of time, basically. Growth of wrestling promotions. During the 1930s and 40s, smaller wrestling promotions engaged in intense competition, frequently poaching talent and engaging what was termed as invasions of rival companies in a bid to attract more fans. This period also witnessed interpromotional matches happening across the country as various promotions sought to establish their dominance in the wrestling industry. So you had multiple companies copying what the Goldust Trio were doing. It proved to be very successful, and whenever you have a successful business, people want a piece of that. So they ended up starting up their own, and we saw these different promotions similar to that style pop up all across the country. And in order to have the most appealing product on the market, they would go around and poach talent. They would grab people, I'll pay you more to come work for me, and steal their talent away from them. Other times you would have interpromotional matches where companies would work together and trade talent briefly, so you have that, ooh, there's a new guy coming in from here and he's fighting, drumming up more interest that way without doing it in a way where it screws anybody over. So it was kind of a nice thing in that way. But with all these different companies, we see the rise of the NWA. No, not that NWA. It's a loose confederation formed among independent companies. The NWA aimed to unify various world championships into a single world heavyweight title. Lou Thesz was chosen to accomplish this task in the late 1940s and 50s. So yeah, we have all these different companies across the country. Everybody has their own titles, their own world titles for every little company that's around. And a few of them got together with the idea of, instead of fighting each other, constantly doing this poaching of talent and just dragging each other down, let's form one cohesive unit and work together. And that's essentially what the World National Wrestling Alliance was. Lou Thesz, as I said here, was chosen to accomplish the task, but it was not the initial plan. Orville Brown was the gentleman who was supposed to be the first world champion, but he suffered a career-ending car injury, so that was unfortunately dropped, and Lou Thesz was chosen to pick up the slack and do that. Which was tough because there were some companies that didn't want Lou Thesz to be the champion and refused for years to let him unify their titles. But eventually, just the power of having so many other companies working together kind of forced their hand, and he did end up becoming the world champion. We have a nice little map here showing all of the different territories across the country and up into Canada. So each of these were different companies operating largely just in your own little section, a state or two here and there. And that was kind of your zone where you would operate, where you would run shows. So beyond this, we're getting into the television age and then what became known as the golden age of wrestling. The first pro wrestling studio television show was taped on December 18th, 1942 in Schenectady, New York. That was on WRGB TV for anyone paying attention. With the advent of television, wrestling matches aired locally and nationally, reaching a larger fan base. The Golden Age, this 48 to 55 period, had immense growth, popularity, and national expansion in pro wrestling. And the beauty of it, too, wrestling aligned well with television due to its easy-to-understand nature, drama, comedy, colorful characters, and cost-effective production. The explosion of TV at this time was perfect for wrestling in a lot of unique ways. This first show in 1942, there were about 5,000 TVs nationally. By 1947, only 5 years later, we're at 44,000. And then by 49, we get to 490,000. And then by 53, we're at 20 million. TV absolutely exploded during this decade. And the beauty of wrestling is, as it says, it was very easy to understand. There's a good guy, there's a bad guy, and they're fighting. What's not to get? It's fun to watch. And it's extremely cheap to produce, much less so than any other TV show would have been at that time. So they really worked well with each other to grow both businesses. We would see new stars making their rise in this time period. Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, Gorgeous George, and Baron Michel Leon. Funny enough, we just talked about Lou Thesz. The match between Lou Thesz and Leon drew a record on May 22nd, 1852, when it pulled in the first $100,000 card. So they pulled in $100,000 for that show, which in 1852 money, if we translate that to today money, that's about $1.2 million. It was a ton of business for that show at that time, and which took a long time to ever really kind of match that. Moderate slowdown in the NWA territory system. So in the 1950s, we see the decline in ratings. By the late 50s, professional wrestling experienced a decline, leading to producers to reduce its presence on television. Lots of stations fully dropped it from their broadcasting entirely. It was just so overexposed. There was too many wrestling shows. It was on too much. It just kind of lost its luster. It was everywhere, and when you watch the same thing over and over again, people get bored of it. And it just wasn't drawing in like it used to. Stations that did keep it on, it was late nights, often very late at night, weekend shows, just not anywhere near prime time anymore. So it just wasn't the hot ticket that it was just a decade prior. The NWA did emerge as the dominant wrestling body in the 50s, however, overseeing numerous wrestling promotions. Some promoters perceived the NWA as restrictive. However, they didn't like necessarily all of what they were forcing them to do, who they were picking to be the champion, and then that led to the departure of several promoters who then formed their own organizations. Prominent promotions and promotional shifts. We have Vern Gagne and the AWA, the American Wrestling Alliance. He started the promotion within the NWA in 1957. Or a promotion, not the same promotion, sorry. And then when he broke away, he established the American Wrestling Association. Gagne's AWA became the dominant organization in the 1960s, with Gagne himself as the top wrestler until his retirement in 1981. During that time period, he also was the AWA champion 10 times. Turns out when you own and run the promotion, you can be champion a whole bunch of times. On the other side, we have Bruno Sammartino and the WWWF. Bruno Sammartino led the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, later renamed the WWF, during the 60s and 70s. Sammartino's charisma and power moves made him the most popular American wrestler of his time. That man is just a beast. That is wild. He carried the WWF during the 60s and 70s. During this period, when Madison Square Garden was their primary arena, Sammartino headlined more cards there, cards, than any other wrestler at 211, and of those, 187 were sellouts. People loved Bruno. He was the second champ of the WWF, beating Buddy Rogers after only 22 days, who then held on to that title for 2,803 days. A very, very long time, before losing it to Ivan Koloff in 1871, at a time when absolutely no one thought Bruno was going to lose, but he did. And there's a funny story, too, because when he lost that title to Ivan during that match, he famously says that after the pinfall, 1, 2, 3, he loses, and he thought that he had damaged his hearing because he couldn't hear anything, because it was silent. The crowd went completely silent, and he thought he could no longer hear anything because his ears were ruined, which was just funny to think back on. Outside of this, we do start getting into the late 70s, early 80s. We see Hulk Hogan and the AWA's decline. Hogan's rise to fame at this time in the AWA brought national attention, but internal disagreements led to his departure in '83, damaging the AWA's reputation. So the AWA was no longer the top promotion after the WWF actually rejoined the NWA in 1971. They did reach new heights, however, with powerhouse wrestler Hulk Hogan, who gained national attention after starring in Rocky III, and became a very solid fan favorite. Funnily enough, when he initially debuted with AWA, he was a bad guy. But his natural charisma and over-the-top shenanigans, just people loved him anyway, and ended up cheering him even when he was supposed to be a bad guy, which led to them being one of their biggest stars. However, Gagne, the owner, thought that the champion should be a pure technical wrestler like himself or Nick Bockwinkel, which meant that he never wanted to make Hogan champion, which that, along with some merchandise arguments led to him leaving in '83. We also have Georgia Championship Wrestling, part of the NWA at this time, achieved a significant success by becoming the first nationally broadcast wrestling program on cable television in 1979. By '81, GCW became the most watched show on cable television, showcasing the continued dominance of the NWA in the wrestling industry. Now we have the 80s wrestling boom. The 80s marked a pivotal era for professional wrestling, witnessing an unprecedented surge in popularity, particularly among America's youth. The World Wrestling Federation, under the leadership of Vince McMahon, played a central role in this phenomenon, revolutionizing the sport with its approach to entertainment and storytelling. So before this, really, we're seeing a large shift where wrestling was, I wouldn't say it's for adults, but generally more of an adult, not themed, but just big tough guys fighting, whereas we got much more colorful, over-the-top, sports entertainment-esque characters, which appealed much more to children. So it just became a whole new group of people who got really in love with these types of characters. On the other side, we have Jim Crockett Promotions. Jim Crockett, also envisioning a national promotion, absorbed several other members of the NWA into a single entity known as Jim Crockett Promotions. So a lot of these other promotions, a lot of the smaller ones, weren't able to compete. Just the way that WWF was exploding through generally less than scrupulous means, through stealing talent outright, buying out television time for these lower promotions. Like, in general, a lot of TV stations at the time, if you wanted to have a show on there, they would pay you a nominal fee, you'd give them a tape, or they would pay you, I should say. You give them a tape, everybody's happy. The WWF, however, was going to these stations saying, here's my tape, I'll pay you to put it on if you take their show off, which most stations were happy to do because you give me money and I still get to keep a show on the air, perfect. Which unfortunately led to them, a lot of those small promotions just not being able to compete anymore. So they all got kind of swept up into one larger group, Jim Crockett Promotions. One of these was the Georgia Championship Wrestling, which ended up changing its name to World Championship Wrestling. The Superstation, TBS, was the parent company there, asked them to change the name because that led to them being more accepted as a national company. Georgia, very regional. World, well, that could be for everybody. That was the idea. Hulkamania and rock and roll wrestling. Hulk Hogan emerged as the face of wrestling during this era, captivating the audiences with his larger-than-life persona and captivating performances. The rock and wrestling connection further propelled wrestling into mainstream culture, as collaboration with music icons like Cyndi Lauper brought added attention and appeal to the sport. Lou Albano, a manager in WWF, came up with the cool idea when he bumped into singer Cyndi Lauper during a trip to Puerto Rico. She ended up just getting along with him very well and cast him in her music video, Girls Just Want to Have Fun. The two hit it off, and they ended up doing a storyline on TV, which led to the Brawl to End It All, where Cyndi Lauper got to pick a wrestler, and Lou Albano got to pick a wrestler, and they fought it out. Live on MTV, music television, for those who don't know. They used to have music on TV, it was weird. They actually had that show that was on MTV at that time, that was the first live wrestling show on cable. Before that, it was all tape shows. And they also had the first live women's wrestling match on cable TV as well, when they showed that match. The evolution of wrestling entertainment. Television became a powerful platform again for wrestling. Events like WrestleMania attracting millions of viewers and solidifying wrestling's status as mainstream entertainment staple. Wrestling seamlessly integrated into pop culture, securing primetime slots again on national television and featuring celebrity appearances, further enhancing its widespread appeal. So before this, since the 50s, we haven't had wrestling really in a primetime setting. And the huge boom we had during the 80s allowed them to get back on primetime television again. 1985 is when we have WrestleMania 1. to counter the AWA's Super Sunday, the NWA's Starrcade, and World Class Championship Wrestling's Star Wars. It was headlined, of course, by Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, facing off against Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper. Again, just utilizing that celebrity tie-in just to make it very appealing to the mainstream audience. Even if you didn't follow wrestling, you knew who Mr. T was. And if you see Mr. T's going to be wrestling, well, I got to check that out. They ended up broadcasting that on 135 closed-circuit networks. So you weren't getting it in your house. You're having to go to someplace that had the closed circuit, and you would watch it there. Out of the 80s, we get into the 90s and the rise of the Attitude Era. The mid-1990s saw the WWF facing stiff competition from WCW, prompting a drastic reinvention known as the Attitude Era. The WWF regained its dominance in the industry by adapting to the changing tastes of its audience and embracing a more provocative and controversial approach. So we have fans who were kids in the mid to late 80s. They're now teens as we're getting into the 90s. They're getting bored of the comic book style wrestlers of the 80s, like Hulk Hogan, Junkyard Dog, Superfly Jimmy Snuka. This very comic booky kind of, and they're bored of it. So as we get into the early 90s, we have what they later dubbed the New Generation Era. And we have wrestlers like The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, Diesel, and Bret the Hitman Hart. Before we get into the Attitude Era, where we have favorites like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Triple H, Mick Foley, Cactus Jack, Dude Love, Mankind, pick one, and then the New Age Outlaws. So we have this shift away from the cartoon comic books into a more teen-friendly, edgy 90s period. So a heavier emphasis on violence, a lot more sex appeal taking place on television, cracking beers over your head and kicking the crap out of your boss. There's lots of good, wholesome television. Also during this 90s, we have the Monday Night Wars that take place. Monday Night Wars between WWF's Monday Night Raw and WCW's Monday Nitro intensified the rivalry between the two wrestling giants. WCW's adoption of the New World Order storyline and edgier content helped it gain the upper hand initially in the early to mid-90s. We also have the emergence of ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, as a third competitor, further intensifying the competition, introducing a hardcore style of wrestling and attracting a dedicated fan base. Extreme, in the name, should be the giveaway there. A very heavy focus on hardcore wrestling, meaning lots of weapons, lots of blood, thumbtacks, flaming tables, crazy stuff, and a very dedicated fan base. They loved themselves some of that violence. Even to the point, it's kind of funny, like looking back at some of those shows, because often it would take place at the same arena, and you would see the same fans in the same seats, show to show. And they were so dedicated to, this is my show, this is my spot, I'm here for the fights. Officially, the Monday Night Wars ran from September 4th, 1995 to March 26th, 2001. However, end of an era. The Monday Night Wars came to an end. WWF emerged victorious in the Monday Night Wars, reclaiming its status as the top wrestling promotion. WCW's decline was hastened by an aging roster and failing attempts to revitalize its product, ultimately leading to its demise in 2001. ECW, despite its passionate fan base and innovative style, faced financial difficulties and filed for bankruptcy in 2001, marking the end of an era in professional wrestling. WCW really got itself into a pickle by promising big bucks to wrestlers in an effort to snag a lot of talent from WWF. They were in a hiring spree in the mid-90s, just hiring everybody that was available, which costs a lot of money. But at the time, Ted Turner, the owner of TBS, Turner Network, didn't mind paying it. He was very happy for what wrestling had done for his stations and was happy to spend money because it just meant a lot to him. However, TBS, or Turner Broadcasting, merged with Time magazine to eventually become Time Warner, and then that merged with AOL to become AOL Time Warner. Corporate mergers, don't we love them? But as that happened, he lost power within that company. He was no longer the big head honcho. And as he lost that power, he lost the ability to do anything about it. And the higher-ups at that new venture were sick of losing money, and they ended up just closing it down. and eventually selling it off to none other than Vince McMahon, the owner of WWF. He was able to buy out his competition and wrapped up the Monday Night Wars. Out of this, however, we have the rise of independent wrestling in the early 2000s. A few companies, we have Ring of Honor in 2002, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla 2002, Total Nonstop Action also in 2002, even a little company called Chikara in 2002. So WCW closed its doors and left a big void in the wrestling world. But a couple of companies stepped up to fill those shoes. We have TNA, Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, and Ring of Honor, who popped up. And they've been making waves ever since, really. TNA kicked things off with weekly pay-per-views. You had to pay, I think, $10 a week to watch their show before eventually moving to monthly pay-per-views. And then eventually they got a TV deal, so you didn't have to pay for it anymore, so that was nice. Ring of Honor kept doing their thing as a small little independent wrestling, very focused on technical wrestling, just have very hard-hitting, grappling action in the ring. PWG, similar style, a little more high-flying, a little more bombastic in a way. And then Chikara was, what if wrestling was a comic book? And then that was the show. It was very family-friendly, very fun to watch for sure. And then that's it. That's the end of wrestling forever. Or is it? A new challenger approaches. So we have roughly 15 years of just WWE International scale. And with anything, unfortunately, when you don't have competition, you become stale. You get very complacent because what else are you going to watch? But in 2018, we have the groundbreaking All In event. This event was a historic night in independent wrestling. Cody Rhodes and the Young Bucks, famous wrestlers from New Japan, the Young Bucks are. Cody Rhodes initially in WWE before he left. They organized what they called All In on September 1st, 2018. Featuring talent from Ring of Honor, New Japan Pro Wrestling, Impact Wrestling, CMLL from Mexico, along with AAA from Mexico, Major League Wrestling, and the NWA, which is still kind of kicking around, believe it or not. Just a bunch of talent from all over the world, tons of different companies coming together, and it was the first non-WWE WCW event to sell 10,000 tickets since 1993. Very long time since that could possibly have happened, and many didn't know if it ever would happen. But they were able to do it. On the back of this, we have the birth of AEW, All Elite Wrestling, and the industry shakes up. Launching of All Elite Wrestling, the success of All In leads to the creation of AEW by Cody Rhodes, the Young Bucks, and the Khan family in 2019. The Khan family being Shad Khan and his son Tony Khan, owners of the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Fulham soccer team over in the UK. Billionaire family, lots and lots of money. And that really led to a significant actual competition to a WWF, or WE rather. Going back in time. They have significant financial backing. When you have a billion-dollar family ready to spend some money, you can do a lot, which allowed them to get back on national television, on TNT. Funnily enough, the same Turner stations that started wrestling back when cable was popular are back in the wrestling business again. And then lastly, we have here, the Forbidden Door opens wide. Expanding collaborations and the Forbidden Door. So the Forbidden Door is a term coined by a Japanese wrestler named Hiroshi Tanahashi out of New Japan. This came about when he wanted to wrestle some people that weren't in his company. And he made the phrase, "I wish someone would open the Forbidden Door and let me wrestle somebody else," basically, which led to an event called the Forbidden Door. AEW and Impact in New Japan started fostering interpromotional collaborations. They would send wrestlers back and forth and let people wrestle on different shows. Even though you're contracted here, go wrestle a match there. In an interesting way, it kind of revitalized almost a similar situation to what the territory systems were doing, where you have a big wrestler in your territory, let's send him over there and let him wrestle over there for a little bit. It helps them out, it boosts our caliber as well by let people see us more often. And then it was just an interesting way to help everybody out. Kenny Omega, one of the biggest stars in AEW at this time, was their world champion, and then began appearing on other shows like TNA and AAA down in Mexico and won their world champions. You had one person winning multiple world champions across multiple companies at the same time, which since the 50s hadn't made sense. It was just kind of a crazy thing to see a revolution of, almost in a way. And that is the end. Or is it? It is. It's the end of the slide. But beyond this, we can't really talk about it because it's no longer the history of pro wrestling. It's the current of professional wrestling. And that's a different panel. So for history-wise, we got to leave it there. One last thing I did want to say. We are in a library, so we got to talk about some wrestling books, right? We have Hooker by Lou Thez. A lot of the early stuff that I talked about for wrestling in the early 1900s, a lot of the information came from that book. If you're interested in that time period, read it. It's fascinating. The Death of WCW by R.D. Reynolds and Brian Alvarez is a beautiful look into the rise of WCW and what fell apart or what happened. Sometimes on a week-to-week basis, exactly what's happening inside the company. A really interesting look into that. We have Grappler, Memories of a Masked Man. That's from a wrestler who was a mid-tier wrestler in the territory days in that late 60s, early 70s era. A really fun time to look and see kind of what it was like working as a wrestler in that time period. And then lastly, Have a Nice Day by Mick Foley, a tale of blood and sweat socks. For those who don't know, Mick Foley was a wrestler who came up largely in the mid-'80s, and then in the kind of the dying days of the territory system, and then moved in through WCW, International Wrestling, and then had a huge break in WWF. Just a fun look at a guy's life and career and how he navigated all that. But that is all I have for you today. I do want to give some time if anybody has any questions. Feel free to raise your hand. We're going to bring a microphone around so you can talk into it. It's for the camera. We do need you to talk in the mic.
Hello?
You're not going to hear it.
So I was going to ask about Glow. I noticed that. I didn't see it in the presentation, and that was kind of a huge thing, right? Back in, like, for the ladies.
I wouldn't say it was huge. It was about as big as it got for women. Unfortunately, for most of the time period we talked about, women in wrestling really weren't taken seriously. For the most part, they were kind of relegated to either valets, walking dudes to the ring looking like managers, or kind of special attractions like, ooh, we have a ladies match on. You gotta come see that. It was never really taken seriously until way later than it was supposed to. Glow, what he's talking about, Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, was a fun promotion that was an all-women's wrestling promotion in the mid-'80s, featuring very colorful characters. There's a show that was on Netflix, Glow, that was about that. It was kind of a dramatization of that, a lot of stuff that happened in that. Not the best portrayal of stereotypes for many, many, many reasons. But if you can look past that and appreciate it as a product of its era, it can be entertaining. Just watch the show. It's easier to find. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Any questions? Oh, we got a hand back here. Okay.
Yeah.
I got a good one for you.
There you go.
Do you know the history of Black Saturday?
Black Saturday, yes. When they
Vince,
put WWF on TBS.
yeah,
for
and
the
they
first
stole
time.
they stole the time slot, so they got the money for WrestleMania of $1 million.
Yep.
And that's
Yep.
what paid for WrestleMania, and that's what kind of started the downfall of Crockett because they didn't know how to manage money.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yep.
Crockett was pretty big until they started getting in other things besides wrestling. And
That's true.
And Ric Flair was the flagship of that, and Dusty was the flagship of that program.
Mm-hmm.
And then you know what happened after that. Sold the WC, and then it all went to you know where.
Absolutely. So what he's referring to there is what became known as Black Saturday. There was a time period when WCW or GCW, kind of at the Georgia Championship Wrestling at the time, was on TBS, and Vince McMahon and the WWF bought their time slot. So where people would tune in to watch their wrestlers, they were seeing WWF instead, which made people very, very angry because they wanted to see their wrestling. They wanted Ric Flair, damn it, which eventually led to them being Jim Crockett and whatnot, buying that slot back from Vince for $1 million, which was just before WrestleMania. So if that time slip was never purchased back, there may never have been a WrestleMania because that money might not have been there. So it's an interesting cascade of events that perfectly happened to allow us to get to where we are, which if it didn't happen exactly like that, might not have ever happened. Any other questions? Oh, we got a couple hands now. Okay.
Thank you. You mentioned in the early 2000s the rise of independent pro wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious to know, who would you consider one of the more important independent wrestlers of the last 25 years or so?
Oh, that's a big question. It's hard to pick just one because there's just so many that came. We saw this rise of independent wrestling, which was a ton of wrestlers working their butts off in incredible, incredible ways and really changing the landscape of wrestling as a whole. The Young Bucks are probably way up there. A very flashy tag team, Matt and Nick Jackson, who were part of the founding of AEW that we just talked about a little bit ago. They had their rise to prominence on the independent scene. Kevin Steen would probably be one that I would rate very high, who became Kevin Owens, if you're familiar on the WWE television. Similar with El Generico, who became Sami Zayn on AEW television. Man, wrestling's really good right now, guys. There's just so much good wrestling out there to watch. I'd probably say those four would probably be my biggest for sure out of that time period.
Thank you.
Over here.
Was it right from the beginning that the champion was kind of pre-chosen, or when did it get to that point, or is it at that point?
It's somewhat to where it was like fully predetermined. We're talking like the late 20s into the 30s. There was some iffiness in the Frank Gotch era, but he was a very legitimate tough guy for sure. And a lot of this time was, and especially during that time period, there was a lot of double crossing that would happen as well, where we would have worked matches that would then turn into a shoot. I told you the vocab would come back up. So they would start as a work, like we're going to finish here and we're going to go over, and that's fine. And then they would just start actually fighting, and then it would become a shoot fight. And then whoever won that actually won. There were definitely many times, specifically, we talked about the Goldust Trio a little bit ago. There was a time where their biggest star, one of their young rising stars, was supposed to become the champion. And the champion at that time, Zbyszko, I can't think of his first name, but Mr. Zbyszko, decided that he didn't, before Larry, same family though, yes. He decided he didn't want to lose. I'm not going to let you be the champion. So just continued to mercilessly beat the crap out of this young guy in the ring, to the point where the ref had to call the match, because if he didn't, he was afraid a riot was about to start. That was a very famous downfall of that, actually. They lost a lot of leeway, a lot of star power throughout that whole fiasco because someone didn't want to lose and just took liberties in the ring. So it's kind of hard to say exactly where the line is, because it got real blurry for a few decades to where it kind of was, but sometimes it wasn't. It's hard to say. Any more? Any questions?
Oh, here's the mic.
Oh, yes.
What about what happened to Bruiser Brody?
Bruiser Brody, yes. He was a famous wrestler in the late 70s to early 80s. He was unfortunately murdered backstage after a wrestling show. Very, very tragic story. A very huge wrestler. Not like Hulk Hogan big, but very popular for a lot of people.
Yeah, he's big in Japan. Mm-hmm. They loved him.
Yeah, yeah. But it was which is still kind of a cold case. I don't think anybody ever actually got charged with that crime, but it sounds like people know, but it's like it was in Puerto Rico is where he was murdered. And there's a TV show, The Dark Side of the Ring, a very nice documentary series that showcases a lot of the dark stories of wrestling. They did an episode about that. Very wonderful telling of what happened in a very sad and dark way. Bring a box of tissues, you're going to need it. But great show if you're all interested in some of those older history of wrestling type things.
What would be a top priority for a federation owner? Would they focus on the live gate or trying to sell pay-per-views? What is needed to have that company succeed?
It really depends on which time period we're talking about. Even once pay-per-view becomes kind of a big deal in the more early 90s, to where pay-per-view kind of became a deal. Anytime before that, it was all about the live gate. That's really all that mattered. As we got further past that, pay-per-view became the lifeblood, especially for WWF. If they weren't selling the pay-per-views and the numbers that they were, they probably wouldn't have stayed afloat. Their live gates started tapering off in the early 90s as people got tired of that comic book character vibe. They still weren't selling as many tickets, but it's a lot cheaper to buy it on TV than it is to go to the show. So the pay-per-views kept them alive for sure, for a long time.
Because I watched that wrestler special about Ohio Valley wrestling.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And they're saying you can't get pay-per-views. They don't have the technology. They can't run the technical part of the industry.
Yeah, for a long time, you had to kind of have an in to a television company to get it onto the pay-per-view for a long time. The kind of got a lot easier as we got into the later 90s and the rise of satellite television, because they'll put anything on the air. They don't care. So that became a lot easier for some of those smaller shows to get on there as well. But even as we get into nowadays, through the rise of the internet, we have independent wrestling, like little shows that have 50 people in the crowd that I can watch on my TV from home. Like little shows that feature wrestlers I've never heard of before in some bodunk town in the middle of nowhere, but I can watch it on TV. It's kind of an interesting time right now to where you can watch all of the wrestling.
Well, especially with YouTube.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, got another one back here. And up here as well.
Do you think WCW would have been as successful in early '94 if the steroid scandal didn't happen for WWE that allowed Hulk Hogan to leave the promotion?
Yes, I still think they would have been maybe not as successful. What he's referring to is there was a big steroid scandal in the WWF to where they were facing almost congressional hearings. They were being sued by the government because they were distributing steroids directly to their wrestlers, which is super illegal. And which led to them being sued. They ended up winning the lawsuit, funny enough, but just it hurt them a lot in the public eye, which also led to the rise of a lot of wrestlers that probably wouldn't have been as popular either. Like as we're seeing the no longer push of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, the big buffed out dudes, we're seeing the rise of Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, much sleeker, kind of normal looking dudes. Still strong, still tough, but not over bodybuilder size. So it kind of saw the rise of a different type of wrestler, which I think also shifted a lot of the industry too. Oh, up front here.
What are your thoughts on the current Vince McMahon situation and the effects it's going to have on the future?
It's absolutely disgusting and horrifying and depressing in a lot of ways. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty. You can look up the details if you want. It's very awful things that happened in that company for what seems like decades. He was asking the recent Vince McMahon allegations that had come out. I think like largely it's going to be significantly beneficial for the industry as large, because if we can weed that kind of business out of those types of people out of the industry, that's a huge benefit for everybody. That's just, it's gross. Don't read the details. You don't need to know the specifics. It's bad. It's bad.
How do you think it's going to affect the future of the company?
I don't think it'll affect them necessarily largely, unless we're getting into like super details, like if there's discovery, does it go to trial? That could go any number of ways, so it's kind of hard to say. Financially speaking, it's hard to say, but I think culture-wise, it's a net positive. Anything else? I think we're good. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. Hope it was informative in some way. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for watching our presentation. In order to discover upcoming events at the library, please visit our website, westlandlibrary.org, and click on our events calendar for a full list of everything that we have. You can also visit our Facebook page at Westland Library for daily updates. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you soon.